every game you've ever played or loved was built upon the shoulders of a giant. Not giants plural, mainly just one. idSoftware. That isn't to suggest there weren't other developers making incredible games at the time. There absolutely were, but the technology to skyrocket gaming to the heights we've seen it reach now was born within the idSoftware offices. While it's true that Doom is in large part responsible for kickstarting the video game industry into the media Goliath that it currently is, and it's also true that we owe the majority of our genre staples to that game, Doom is the right shoulder upon which so much of the industry stands. And I think everyone knows it. What people seem to talk about less, however, at least in my experience, is the left shoulder of that same giant. Doom's darker, weirder, more socially awkward cousin, as it were. Quake, a game that was equally as, if not more so, pivotal in setting the standard for what the video game industry would go on to become, and somehow seems to receive less credit. But granted, that is anecdotal. Before Quake, the best you could hope for from a shooter was what we now refer to as 2.5D. Since most games at the time were being made with what Doom had done in mind, and since very few people have the rocket science super genius coding know-how of John Carmack, a lot of developers were limited in what they could really develop. We did get some really great games from this era, like Blood, Duke Nukem 3D, Hexen, Shadow Warrior, and Dark Forces, but none of these games were truly 3D. To put it simply, the technology had just not progressed far enough for developers to create shooters in fully 3D worlds yet. We'd seen other developers achieve something close with games like Star Fox, but most developers were still just shy of achieving that fully 3D game world with 100% omnidirectional movement and character autonomy. Which is why idSoftware was creating a new IP to shatter the ceiling of what a video game was capable of becoming. Quake was 100% true 3D. I'm talking the environments, the assets, the enemy character models, even your weapons, all genuine 3D models. Okay, stop right there. I know you're typing about Battlezone, Tempest, and Descent, all three of which pioneered the art of true 3D years before Quake hit the market, and there's a couple of things to note about that. Being first doesn't mean being best. It's true Quake was not the first game to deliver a 100% true 3D video game experience to the market, but I will tell you right now that it was the first game to master it. The lighting advancements made along with a few technological upgrades allowed Quake to play smoother and faster than any other shooter on the market while looking better and still being true 3D. How did they pull this off exactly? And by they I mean John Carmack. Did he summon up some kind of dark magic or interact with an ancient tome that guided his path? Nope, he did something even harder. He got really good at coding in the 90s. Now you might be thinking, wow, this looks great for a game released in 1996, and well, that's because this is actually the remastered version from Night Dive with hundreds of improvements both graphically and mechanically. Not to mention some extra new content, but we'll get to that later. The original Quake looked more like this. And honestly, even that looks good compared to what it was like trying to run it on ancient hardware through an ugly monitor big enough to hold down a mountain. Be grateful for what you have, kids. Now, Quake is obviously known for its viciously dark atmosphere. A Lovecraftian, horror-adjacent, hyper-violent first-person shooter. Cold steel interiors mixed with blood-crusted ancient stone buildings opening ever rarely into the blackened skies, accented only by the purple clouds that soar above you. Grotesque interdimensional monsters and tortured bodies strung up to the walls hung to suffer forever as they writhe about in agony. So it may surprise some of you to know that the origins of Quake go way back to before the original Doom had even been released, to a time when the founders of idSoftware sat around a table playing none other than the whimsical fantasy tabletop game called Dungeons & Dragons. The party called themselves the Silver Shadow Band, and each member of the group represented a core stat of the game itself as they rode upon the back of a silver dragon taking on jobs in their fight for justice. And their band of heroic warriors was a character named Quake, who wielded a powerful hammer that was capable of devastating entire buildings with its magic. Quake was the character who represented strength in their party, and along with his hammer, he also held a powerful Hellgate cube that could attack their foes with lightning. This campaign ended when idSoftware co-founder John Romero traded a Demonomicron book to a demon in exchange for a powerful sword called the Daikatana. So many ideas born from this single D&D game. But our focus is on Quake right now, a game that was at the time being conceptualized as a melee-focused fantasy game. I'm talking magic spells, swords, wizards, the whole deal. This was after they had decided not to call it The Fight for Justice and make it a 2D side-scroller, by the way. Needless to say, the development of this game was pretty troubled at the time. It ended up going through various concepts and iterations, with the whole team going back and forth on what they even wanted the game to be. As development continued, the team began to conceptualize the title as Timequake, because they wanted the slipgates to transport players to different time periods and locations. They then had to deal with a legal issue because some German company apparently owned all of the iterations of the word Quake they wanted to use, or so I read. I tried to do some digging to find out what this was about and what company they had to bargain with to use the word, but I couldn't find anything except this tech company called Quake Global. So I guess if you have any info on what I'm talking about here, drop it in the comments. Eventually, the game we now know was carved out from the many iterations of its past concepts, and we received the dark, Lovecraftian-inspired first-person shooter that would revolutionize the industry. What I really want to talk about, though, is the driving narrative force behind this game and the universe within which everything we're all so familiar with occurs. Now, there's already a lot of really great videos out there about this game that talk in depth about the incredible technological feats accomplished by Carmack, or go super in depth about the level design, gameplay, where to find the secrets, and things of that nature, many of which I love. Creators like Ahoy and Civi11 have handled that way better than I ever could, even if that lens was my strong suit, which it isn't anyway. I want to focus on the things like what these levels and enemies are in relation to the world building and in-universe lore we encounter. So that's what we're going to explore here as we dive into the universe of Quake. Everything that happens in this game is actually the result of attempts to experiment with teleportation technology. The government called this new tech slipgates, and were able to instantaneously teleport whoever walked through them to another location entirely. They were still learning how to use and control the technology though, and because of that there were clear vulnerabilities in their engineering. Humanity was playing with forces beyond what they were prepared to face. By opening these slipgates, humanity opened the door to other dimensions and caught the attention of a malevolent entity who utilized the opportunity to invade the Earth and begin killing humans. This entity has been given the codename Quake. We play an unnamed soldier tasked with entering these slipgates in order to learn what we can about this entity and its army, so we can try to find a way to stop it or die trying. Players now refer to this character as Ranger, and that's been kind of accepted at this point, but back then, he had no name, because he was you. Unlike the previous two idSoftware games, Quake doesn't lean nearly as much on a science fiction aesthetic, instead choosing to focus on a more fantasy-inspired medieval gothic look through most of its runtime. Although there are still some sci-fi themes and designs throughout the game, most of these were actually last-minute additions. This manifests in the form of dark castles and otherworldly caverns the player must progress through while trying to find a way to stop the interdimensional threat to humanity known as Quake. The game opens with us as the player standing in a small hub area with 3 hallways to choose from. These halls are how the player can select the difficulty for their subsequent playthrough. I chose normal difficulty here, which is what the majority of the footage in this video will be played on, but there will be footage of a few levels I played through on Nightmare as well. The entrance to said Nightmare difficulty is hidden and can be found by exploring this hub area. I won't show you exactly where it's hidden, but I will show you this hint on the screen. After selecting a difficulty path, we're taken to the inside of a human military base, and according to the lore, we are currently under attack from Death Squad sent in by Quake, so we need to be fast in our mission before there's no Earth left to save. This is the second part of the same hub area, and shows us 4 potential paths to take, each leading to a separate slipgate. The first slipgate we approach is called the Dimension of the Doomed, and the game tells us that in this episode, the mystical past comes alive. That's the slipgate there, and so we enter. Within a few seconds of entering the first level, we encounter our first enemy. The Grunts are human soldiers, very much like yourself, who have had their brains rewired by one of Quake's probes to elicit a super pleasurable reaction every time they take a life. They're one of the more common enemies you'll have to face, so go ahead and get used to killing mind-altered humans. Also, like you, they've all been armed with the standard issue shotgun, which is good because we'll be needing that ammo. The Dimension of the Doomed is made up of 7 main levels and 1 secret level, which means our goal is to find that slipgate so we can use it as our starting point to enter Quake's domain where these things are coming from, and then learn what we can about it so we can find it and kill it. Also, this is obviously one of the most iconic Quake maps ever made because it's the first one of the game, and is one of those maps that has been dialed in so well in terms of speedrunning that I'm not sure we'll ever see a new record at this point. There's so many elements of this map that were done specifically to show off the improvements of this engine over the previous one, as was a rule by this map's designer, John Romero. It's a fantastic map and makes for a great introduction into the game, but we can't forget that our goal here in the Slipgate complex is to find the gate where Quake's forces are coming through and take the fight to their home turf. Once we clear out the complex and find the Slipgate, it takes us into another realm of existence entirely. This level is called the Castle of the Damned, and instantly you'll notice how different the design here is from the last mission. The steel corridors and metal interiors have been replaced with cold stone and old wood to represent that this is very much a castle, although it doesn't seem to be one in our own home dimension given the purple skies above us. This medieval fantasy aesthetic will be one of the more common ones we'll see throughout the game. Also introduced in this level is one of the more formidable common enemies we'll be facing. The Ogre is a large, monstrous beast sporting a chainsaw in one hand and a grenade launcher in the other. Despite how common they'll be across these realms, they are still a very dangerous enemy that is liable to mess you up if you aren't keenly aware of where it is in relation to your own position. Given that it's equipped with both a brutal close-range attack and an explosive long-range one, these things are very deadly opponents to face off against. I'm going to spread these enemy explanations out across the levels, by the way, so don't take when I talk about them as a sign of their initial appearance in-game. That will be the case sometimes, but not every time. The castle we're in right now features a kind of aqueduct that flows through it, which introduces us to the fact that running water plays a pretty major part across many of Quake's different maps. In fact, swimming is commonly necessary to progress through the game. A lot of the secrets within this level are in the water as well, so although you don't need to spend much time in the water, there is a lot to find if you do. Moving through a massive gate referred to in-game as an arch, we progress deeper into the castle as we enter our third level titled the Necropolis, a dark underground catacomb built around a small subterranean lake. Here we'll find out that not only is this castle we're currently in massive, but that it's been built with these enormous underground catacombs in mind. Fittingly enough, here in the Necropolis we also meet another new enemy type. I mean, you already know what this is. It's an undead corpse forced to live on in agony with no release in sight, and that's for real too because you can't really kill these things. If you fill them full of bullets or nails, they'll just lie there for a minute and then agonizingly peel themselves back up to pursue you. The only way to truly be rid of these vile abominations of nature itself is to destroy the corpse in such a fashion that there's nothing left to pick itself back up again, i.e. you have to literally blow them into pieces with a rocket, grenade, or some form of explosion. I wonder if they're still alive after doing this and they just suffer in forever torment as a chunk of flesh, or if by blowing them into physical pieces offers some kind of spiritual peace. When you're playing through these levels, it can be easy to see them as just an assortment of maps to play, but when you really look at it, you can see the intention of the map designers like Romero, McGee, Peterson, and Willits to create a clear flow with how these maps connect. Like how the Necropolis connects so seamlessly to the next map called the Grizzly Grotto. Of course, there's a clear loading screen in between each mission, but we can still feel the air of the very same castle we found ourselves in after entering the Slipgate, and the sheer size of this castle is mesmerizing. At least I think it's all still the same castle. I'd actually genuinely love to see someone map out the full structure starting with the Castle of the Damned and connect all of these levels in a one-to-one way where we can just play straight through the whole episode with no loading screens. That would be so cool. If someone ever does that, please DM me. I would love to play that. As the name suggests, this map hosts a large grotto taking us even deeper into the underground caverns. This level also features one of the deepest lakes in the game where we have to use the swimming mechanic quite a bit, which is fun. One thing about these underground sections is that most of these levels move us in and out of interior environments, so we never feel like we're super deep underground, but more like this castle has been built into the side of a mountain and so had to carve itself through a lot of rock to exist. This is also the first level in the game where we can access a secret level. Completing the mission normally will take you to the next map, of course, but if you press some buttons and open up a hidden passageway passageway beneath a lake, you can access a hidden map called Ziggurat Vertigo. Falling into this underground basement area of the castle, we can immediately see how different gravity feels here. Each time we jump, it's like we're floating, and this allows us to access very high up areas with relative ease. This is actually super ambitious mechanically, and I'm pretty sure marks the first instance of this low gravity gameplay in an FPS game. Although to be fair, it's probably just the same as the swimming mechanic but without the water. We're locked in a series of rooms built around this apparent ziggurat, and with the gravity being so low, it adds an entire new element to how fighting feels here. Finding this secret level gives you an early glimpse at some enemies you wouldn't normally have encountered yet, but we'll get to them later. If things seem a little bit different here design-wise than the other maps we've looked at, well, there's a reason for that. Map design duties for Quake were split up between 4 different developers, each with their own unique style and sensibilities. This map is one of 2 in the first episode designed by Marikie. Excluding the first level we talked about by John Romero, the rest of Episode 1's maps were handled by Tim Willits, who, in an interview with NoClip, said that idSoftware were being pretty haphazard about how they were designing the maps, letting each dev just kind of do whatever they wanted. This resulted in a pretty jarring gameplay experience, which I think actually benefits the game's unsettling atmosphere, even if it wasn't intentional. Each of the 4 developers had an episode where they handled the majority of the maps to try and maintain at least some level of consistency, however. Episode 1 features maps predominantly by Tim Willits. Once we fought our way through that hidden section of the castle, we're able to find our way back on track to the next level titled Gloom Keep, which opens back up into a valley in the mountain we seem to have been fighting through so far. This keep feels almost like its own subsection of the castle with how different the design is. Like it's clearly either connected to, or at the very least, very near the main castle we've been in, but judging from the door we just exited, this seems to be a separate building altogether. The number of environmental hazards and traps here is insane as well, with massive moving spikes that can impale you, stationary perpetually firing nail guns hidden in the walls, and all kinds of similarly brutal contraptions. I think these traps might harken back to when Quake was intended to have an Aztec aesthetic before the game shifted directions. Now's a good time to talk about another one of the enemies you'll find here as well. The knights are exactly what they sound like. Wicked men coated in medieval armor wielding a long sword with a propensity for taking your life. They're not all that dangerous due to their sword relegating them exclusively to close-range combat, but if they get the drop on you or outnumber you, they can become a serious problem very fast. Also, I love how this Quake logo is casted onto the ground like a shadow. Very cool. This is easily one of the more confusing Episode 1 levels to get through, I feel like, due to how it's designed. Even after having played it multiple times before this, I still kind of struggled with finding my way through it. In the bottom of this keep, we locate a portal which, when we go through it, takes us to the next level called the Door to Chthon. This is another relatively confusing level to reckon with because it plays with portals and lighting in a way that can be very jarring to first-time players. The way this level is laid out makes it reliant on learning the various moving parts of the map, like this massive crusher wall. There's also more than a few switches we have to press in order to access new segments of the map, and some of them require being pressed more than once. I do love this though, it feels so deadly, like you're battling through a house of traps. It's actually a great map, and the point of it all is to locate the rune keys so that we can enter through this door, which is the aforementioned Door to Chthon. Again, it feels quite a bit different from a lot of the other maps so far because this is the second American McGee map in Episode 1. Although I do think it blends with the Tim Willits maps that come before it well enough to seem like the jarring nature was on purpose. I actually found it to be one of the more memorable levels overall because of the dynamic elements like hidden walls and ceilings that open to reveal enemies and whatnot. With the needed rune keys collected, we're able to access the door and proceed to the final level of Episode 1, the House of Chthon. It's kind of like a boss battle, but also kind of not. And in case you couldn't tell, that giant angry lava monster is Chthon. Traditional weaponry can't actually damage him, so don't waste your ammo. What you have to do is strafe around the room and flip a series of switches to activate these lightning conductors, and then the blast from that is what hurts him. Chthon really is just a giant lava monster who has been named ruler of this dimension of the doomed we've been in, and I assume owner of the castle we've spent this whole time ransacking. There isn't much to know about him except that according to later lore, we don't kill him here despite what the game tells us, but rather we just defeat him to the point where he is exiled to a different domain and replaced with a different entity. With Chthon defeated, we see our first congratulations message. These little messages are really the only way the game actively tries to communicate a story to the player within the game itself, and you only get 5 of them in the base game. After fighting your way through the dimension of the doomed and overcoming Chthon, our character finds the first of 4 runes, the Rune of Earth Magic. These runes are pretty much our primary plot MacGuffin, and the whole story is centered around locating all 4 of these runes before we can find and confront the vicious monster codenamed by Earth as Quake. So something of note here is that this is the last thing shareware players would have seen back in the 90s and early 2000s. For those of you who don't know, the way idSoftware made a lot of its money wasn't by selling their games outright, but by releasing the first portion of their game for free to players to try out, and restricting the rest behind a paywall. It'd be fair to call it a demo, but the term they used for it back then was shareware. So players would download the first episode of Quake for free, and that's what would hook them into buying the rest to see what they were missing. So for some players, this may have been where they jumped off if they were unwilling to spend the money for the rest of the game, but for others, this was just the start of their adventure. To those that were invested enough in the experience now to pursue the rest, they would find their way back to the World Selection Hub where the slipgate to the Dimension of the Doom had been locked off, ushering them to press on into the next episode titled The Realm of Black Magic. Thank you for watching this far, and we're about to get into the next episode of Quake, but before we do, I wanted to quickly tell you that I've put up a brand new t-shirt for sale designed by me to celebrate Quake in an original, authentic, and stylish way. So if you've been on the lookout for some cool Quake-inspired merch, now's your chance to comp something made by a genuine fan of the franchise. Also, I've released my own cover of the Quake theme originally performed by 9 Inch Nails, produced entirely by me, which you've heard a snippet of in this video already and will hear a bit more of throughout. It's available on pretty much all streaming services, so go throw that on your gym or driving playlist. All of this was made in celebration of what I think is one of the greatest video games of all time, and so I wanted to throw every single skill I had into making a celebratory event out of this video, both for myself and the community. So thanks so much for all of your support, and links to both of these are in the description below. Now let's get back to the video. With the Rune of Earth magic now in our possession, our goal has become plunging through the second slipgate in search of the second rune. The first location we find is called the Installation, and seems to be man-made, although no less overrun by the monsters under Quake's control. This sci-fi aesthetic is a good indicator that we're still inside the human facility on Earth, which is actually where the first map of every episode is set. This is a great time to talk about one of the lower level enemy types we've been fighting up to now. Rottweilers are dogs that were being kept by the human military here, and much like the grunts we've been fighting up to now, they too have fallen under Quake's control. Unfortunately, there is no way to undo this process in humans or animals, as the probe's alteration permanently affects the brain of the creature it rewires, leaving execution as the only remaining viable option. I actually love the sci-fi levels in Quake. They're very uncommon since so much of the game is spent in the dark fantasy realms of the other dimensions, but something about these brief stints spent in our own realm feels like such a great way to ground the player before sending them into the abyss. This area clearly isn't in Quake's dark domain, but it does possess the slipgate we need to take us into the vicinity of the second rune. I have this speculative theory as to why we're always coming out so close to where the runes are when we travel through these slipgates. It's just my own theory, but hear me out. What if the exit locations of these slipgates are not random or coincidental? I suspect their destination drops the interloper out near the energetic presence of the rune due to a frequency familiarity between the portal and the rune itself. Either way, once we're through that slipgate, then it's just a matter of tracking down the rune. We have now entered the Ogre Citadel, a large chapel-like and ornate building which seems to have once been home to a far more hopeful purpose before now being overrun by these loathsome creatures. Either that, or these ugly beasts have a great taste for architecture. As the name suggests, you'll be fighting through a lot of ogres on this map, but there's no shortage of other enemies either. There's a lot of water running through the Citadel, but this river seems to remain a theme throughout this episode, and at times it almost feels like we're following it through the chaotic assortment of locations. These maps all feature a great deal of verticality too, but that was one of Quake's big bragging points over its competition at the time. Episode 2 ends up feeling more consistent in its design than Episode 1 did, since every map here was handled by John Romero except for the secret level. This means that every map's design and intention had a smoother progression between them since they were all designed by the same developer. This is true of Episode 4 too, but we'll get to that. This Citadel is only the first building in this collection of horrid structures though. Pushing through to the other side, we find a gate that takes us to the next area. The Crypt of Decay. This map in particular is actually very important for a few reasons, the first of which is that it is home to the Well of Wishes, a small secret where we can find the iconic idSoftware Dopefish. The second reason this level is important is that it holds the portal to the second secret level of the game, which we'll get to. The most important fact about this level is that earlier on in development, it was supposed to house an Old One. For those of you who don't know, the concept of the Great Old Ones are ancient cosmic entities from the mythos of H.P. Lovecraft. In the context of this game, Old Ones serve a similar purpose and do directly lift terms and names from Lovecraft's mythos, but change a few things up here and there. In the case of this map, the Old One that was to be held captive here would have been called Shantak. Now, Shantak is a Lovecraftian name, but in that mythos, it refers to a dragon-like beast. According to what we know about early drafts of Quake's story, there were intended to be multiple Old Ones encountered throughout the game, rather than the one we do end up fighting. Shantak, the Old One, would have been restrained here, attached to a matrix that siphoned him of his power to generate an energy field for protecting an ICBM launch site. This is also the map that introduces us to the... Although these guys might look a lot like the regular knights, the addition of the word death in their title is well earned. They're stronger, faster, and more resilient than the average knight is, and from this point on, we'll be seeing a lot more of them. Also, unlike the regular knights, these guys aren't just bringing a sword to a gunfight, since they also have a ranged attack where they throw a bunch of fireballs at you, making them as deadly at a distance as they are up close. Let's lead this into the secret level of Episode 2 called the Under-Earth. This level is admittedly quite a bit less novel than the first secret level, but it's still pretty interesting, although it's hard to tell where this area might be located in relation to the other structures of this episode. As you can probably guess, this is the one level in Episode 2 that was not done by Romero, and was handled instead by Tim Willits. Although none of that is to say it's a bad map, I think it's actually great. Much like the main missions surrounding it, this one features the same water-based design flowing through it, and even has us running around in these pipe-like tunnels, not to mention the amount of Death Knights running around here. It's almost like we're in the sewer system for the castle or something, although that feeling only amplifies the deeper into this realm we go. Once we're able to exit this area, we're teleported straight to the next area called the Ebon Fortress. This place is just grotesque. Surrounding the fortress itself is a large moat filled with a repulsive brown-colored water guaranteed to give multiple infections to the various wounds our faithful hero has no doubt incurred so far. It's a pretty big level too, and once we get into the fortress, we can see how massive even some of the interiors are. And the platforming from here on out is only going to become more convoluted as we need to hit switches and perform obtuse actions to unveil our path forward. The slow scale creep of these map sizes is really something of notable praise too. It really does feel like every map seems to be getting bigger and more complex the further we go. This map is actually notorious for being one of the earlier levels where players began getting lost while trying to find their way to the exit too. On the other side of the Ebon Fortress itself lies our penultimate structure of the episode, the Wizard's Manse. This is developer John Romero's favorite map, and I do think it's one of the more memorable ones in the game. There's a lot of weird twisty architecture, and according to the game, it all used to be home to a so-called swamp wizard who practiced his black magic here. We must be closing in on that rune as things are getting much more intense. Judging from the size and quality of the mansion itself, this wizard was either very powerful or very rich. It's loaded with some massive rooms, many of which are sporting stained glass windows with very sophisticated designs. It's also the map that introduces the Thunderbolt to the player, which is the game's strongest weapon. I'll talk about all the weapons later, but this is the first map where we can get the best one. I think one of the most memorable aspects of the mansion is this travel system that traps the player while pulling them underwater and shutting the door behind them. This was done intentionally to scare the player as they lose health in the process, but there are health pickups planted to restore what the player loses along the route. It's an iconic section of the map for sure. Once we finally make it through the Wicked Mansion, we find ourselves in the dismal Oubliette. Man, the names of these maps are so stellar. idSoftware was offering up a kind of unique fantasy world here that I've yet to see another developer come close to rivaling. For those who don't know, an oubliette refers to a deep basement area or room beneath a castle or dungeon where said castle drains into. Typically, oubliettes are only accessible via a hatch in the bottom room that would lead down there, and it's thought by many that people would drop prisoners down the hatch to wither and eventually die slowly. This idea is supported by the fact that the name oubliette comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. The putrid hue of the brown water surrounds us as we kill our way through the cold cavern made of stone in pursuit of our goal. The level itself is sectioned off into multiple sections for us to access as we ascend through the area. We can find an observable change in the look of the environment as we pass through into a cleaner section of castle, having escaped the dungeon. Although it might be cleaner, it's still crawling with enemies for us to kill. This area features a big bridge that breaks off into multiple areas for us to clear before eventually reaching an elevator that takes us down to the end of this structure where we face off against a... The Vor gives off serious body horror vibes, as its top half is humanoid with the bottom half resembling an arachnid of sorts. Earlier on in development, this thing was referred to as a Shalroth, a name originating from the D&D campaign the devs ran at the time. It was changed during development to Vor though, a Latin term meaning to devour. This wretched creature has no eyes because according to Romero, its native realm is dim, humid, and horrific. And that's a quote, actually. The most dangerous thing about Vors is their explosive projectile that tracks the player like a heat-seeking missile. These things can be lethal, but are also relatively slow, which means you can avoid them if you practice at it. Once the Vor is dead, we grab the rune of black magic we came here for and jump through the Slipgate back to the Slipgate complex. The end episode text then tells us that the rune spoke to our player character and told him the name of the old one who has been responsible for all of this chaos. The entity codenamed Quake, the Hell Mother we've been hunting, Shub-Nigrath. We also learn that once all 4 runes have been collected, the gate to Shub-Nigrath will open, allowing us to face the witch goddess herself in her frightful otherworld cathedral. Things are about to change. The previous 2 areas we traveled to were dark, but not like this. The Netherworld is described in-game as a place of primal fear in a strange dimension. This 3rd rune will demand more of us than anything we've seen so far. Entering the Slipgate, we're taken to a station called Termination Central. I read that at one time these sci-fi areas were planned to be ancient Aztec entry points before the team decided to bring back sci-fi elements and traditional FPS mechanics. There was even a whole texture set prepared by developer Adrian Carmack, no relation to John Carmack, but because developer American McGee was uninspired by the Aztec look, they were not used for the main game. As for lore, apparently the first level of each episode is made in this theme because they're all different sections of the same secret military installation that was experimenting with Slipgate technology and has now become overrun by Quake's minions. This was supposedly decided pretty late into development, but I love it. Things haven't gotten too insane yet, but we are dealing with an oddly laid out map so far. Navigating it was immediately more of a challenge than previous levels, and that will be an ongoing trend for the rest of the game from here on out. It doesn't make things any easier that we have to contend with a new variation of the Grunt enemy either. Much like the Grunt, these enforcers are also human soldiers who, before being permanently altered by the mind parasites of Shub-Nigrath, were serving the same side as us. They even speak English and can yell out voice lines at you. Although it is apparently not clear who actually voiced the character, since Romero believed it was either himself or developer American McGee, but there is a chance that the Enforcer was voiced by Trent Reznor, Charlie Clouser, or Chris Vrenna. These guys have more health and are beefier than the average Grunt, and come equipped with a biosuit and a laser rifle, which sadly you can't use yourself in the game, but I guess we do get a Thunderbolt lightning gun which shares an ammunition type with said laser gun. The whole map feels gloomy, and the flickering lights across the area lend to the horror-like atmosphere of what we're fighting against here. This will also only get worse as we press on. Finding the Slipgate at the end of the facility takes us straight into the Netherworld to a place called the Vaults of Zen. Right away we can see things are very different here. Large stone engravings of demonic faces have been carved into the walls as white crosses adorn the corners of the area. Most of the walls across the level are accented with skulls and imagery to evoke a sense of death and despair. Something I did find odd in the map is a large portrait depicting the crucifixion of Christ on the wall. This is the only time we see this in the base game. When paired with the crosses, we could almost assume this was once a Catholic cathedral or something, but given that we're in a completely different dimension here, to have Christian imagery adorn the building like this feels like an odd choice. Unless the implication was that Christianity exists in all dimensions, although given who designed this map, I seriously doubt that. It's especially strange because I'm pretty sure the Netherworld in this game is supposed to be hell, or at least a hell-adjacent dimension given that it houses the rune of hell magic. which is also strange because the Vaults of Zin are an otherworldly location from H.P. Lovecraft's Dreamland Cycle. We see similar imagery in other levels throughout this specific episode, but I'm not super sure what the team was going for here. I do know that both this map in particular and the majority of the maps in episode 3 were handled by American McGee, who is well known for his edgy content, so I'm positive that this wasn't ever that deep, and they weren't super concerned about the lore implications of any of this. I'm gonna have a section specifically talking about the religious iconography of Quake later in the video to talk more about all of this if you're interested in that sort of thing. For now, we push through the Vaults of Zin and into the next map called the Tomb of Terror. I think for a lot of people, the Netherworld episode is what they think of when they remember Quake, because it's so gloomy and so much of it is spent in darkness that I almost felt myself going into a haze while playing through it. It was a very odd sensation. This level in particular is filled with deadly traps and no shortage of lava, as if to remind the player that one wrong step will send them to a fiery demise. All of these traps lend themselves very well to the sinister feeling that everything in this dimension wants to kill you as well. There's this underlying sense of perpetual anxiety while going through these missions that really permeates the longer you play. This is also a great level for me to talk about one of the game's more common enemies you'll be seeing. The Fiend, also referred to in the game's files as the Demon, is a ghastly creature with a hunchback and sharp-bladed arms that it leaps long distances to slice you with. It also has razor-sharp teeth and no eyes, so it must be going off of scent or sonar or something. We're led to believe by Romero that both this creature and the Vor are from the same dark realm, which is why neither of them have eyes, as they don't need them. The fact that it was planned to be called a demon at one point also lends credence to my earlier assertion that this may have been intended to be a hell-like dimension. They can be deadly on their own, but are especially dangerous in groups. They're also similar in appearance to a creature from the Lovecraft mythos called a Ghast. At the end of our time in the Tomb of Terror, we'll find a portal that teleports us to our next location called Satan's Dark Delight, a heavily water-based level featuring an area where you have to wait for this moving platform to progress. This is about the time in the game where things start to feel more and more maze-like, and it only gets harder to navigate from here. In terms of verticality, there was no other game on the market that could even get close to what Quake was offering at the time. The meticulous design of this level is quite literally omnidirectional. They accounted for the design to take you up, down, left, right, forwards, and backwards. I think you could make an entire video essay on just how incredible both the aesthetic design and meticulous layouts of these maps are. To call it a masterclass would still be selling it short. All of the moving parts we see in this level are the exact kind of thing that helped Quake cast a dark shadow on the rest of the industry by showing it not only what was possible, but also what everyone else had yet to achieve. But to be fair, no one else had John Carmack's super genius mega brain coding groundbreaking engines and knocking down office walls so we could watch and make sure that people were working and not slacking off. Apparently that's a real thing that actually happened, by the way. Another interesting thing about this map is that it features a hidden entrance that can take you to another secret level via a wind tunnel. We haven't gotten to those yet, but just remember I brought it up. That portal takes us to a hidden place called the Haunted Halls. Visually, it looks very similar to the last few levels, and this is because of how Quake utilized something called level themes. I'll talk about that later. The whole map is made up of heavy stone architecture, which features entire aqueducts of straight-up lava running through it. This map is probably most known, however, for its usage in Deathmatch, having favored one team so heavily over the other that the community renamed the map something I can't say on YouTube. If you know, you know. While we're fighting through these halls, let's talk about These revolting creatures are floating monsters with a seemingly reptilian skin texture that are able to spit toxic glops of bile at you to inflict damage. I think they bite you if they get too close as well. Before being called Scrags, we can see in the game's code that they were originally going to be referred to as wizards, and before that, Dukes of Sheol. The word Sheol comes from the Hebrew and can be found in the Hebrew Bible. The exact meaning of the word has been a point of contention for thousands of years in theologian circles, but depending on who is using the word, it may be referring to an afterlife underworld that isn't like heaven or hell, but more like a purgatory place for the dead to travel to. Other interpretations suggest it simply means death itself, and could be translated to mean grave. I don't think I'm alone in saying that Scrag was probably the better name for it, though. Once we fight our way out of these haunted halls, we're able to complete the hidden level and move on to the next mission in line, a place called the Wind Tunnels. From both a technological and mechanical standpoint, this level was an unprecedented wonder. I mean, real physics built into the game's engine that were so powerful they could handle throwing you around the map via these massive pipes. I'm pretty sure nothing even close to this had been done before Quake hit the market, and it's just incredible. It's no wonder Carmack went on to become a rocket scientist. It also sucks. At least it does for me in practice of the gameplay. I've played through the original 4 episodes of Quake several times in my life, and every single time I get to this point in the game, I just feel a wave of exhaustion overtake me. I'm not even really sure why, because it's not a bad map and it doesn't even take that long to complete. But something about the massive open areas mixed with the maze-like quality of remembering where each wind tunnel takes you is just exhausting to me for some reason. I'm sure lots of people love this map, and it is a spectacle for a game released in 1996, but this is easily one of my least favorite maps to play. Fortunately, this is the penultimate level before we reach the conclusion of this episode after entering into the Chambers of Torment. This level is insane. First off, it's probably the grandest map of the game so far in terms of scale. Whereas every other map in the game is handled by a single map designer, this one was co-created by both American McGee and Tim Willits. It's also one of the hardest, in my opinion. It's a great mix of weaving the player in between claustrophobic corridors and wide open spaces. And there's quite a few enemies to deal with on this map too. It's honestly so fun. Something I haven't talked about yet that I should bring up here is that a lot of these maps require that classic video game trope of finding keys to unlock doors for your progression. Not all maps need this, but most of them do, this one included. So a lot of your playtime here will be trying to navigate your way to the various keys so you can access more parts of the map. There's just something about the blood-soaked edginess of this nightmarish gothic-inspired fantasy aesthetic that I adore. We really can't seem to get this from modern video games. I mean, sure, the modern Doom games are trying to keep it alive, but even then it's not quite the same as this kind of horror-adjacent tone that Quake was chasing here. I also think this might be my favorite map of the entire game. It's a strong contender for sure. Once we clear out every monster in our path, we're finally able to grab the Rune of Hell magic and jump back through the slipgate to take us home. The game gives us another message to provide additional narrative context to our mission, telling us that the rune forces knowledge into our character's mind. The full nature of this threat has become more apparent to us, and despite the agony our hero has endured thus far, he steels himself for more as we have one final rune to acquire before we can face the old one who threatens the whole of humanity. Returning to our base on Earth, we see that once again the slipgate we recently entered has been locked, and the entrance to the Netherworld has been closed off for good. This leaves us with one last slipgate to venture through and into the darkest dimension yet. Our worst nightmares come true. We drop through into what looks like a flooded basement, only to find the water leads us into an ancient stone building. The barred entrance to the slipgate opens for us as we enter into Entering the portal into the Elder World, we arrive in the first map of the game called simply the Sewage System. This level continues the game's tradition of starting every episode on a map themed with the sci-fi aesthetic of the id-based level theme. I personally loved this. It always felt like such a fun whiplash after spending so long in the medieval fantasy theme levels when I started each new episode back in the sci-fi futuristic Earth look. Now, I feel like reception to the overall levels of the Elder World are kind of mixed. It's well known how they're notoriously more difficult and abstract than the first 3 episodes, and are considerably more Lovecraftian as well thanks to Sandy Peterson's adoration of the Lovecraftian mythos. Some people don't like Peterson's maps due to their convoluted nature, but I love them. The Elder World is probably my favorite episode because of how dark and abstract it all is. Whereas the previous 3 episodes can all be completed in roughly an hour or less each, this one will probably take you a bit longer to overcome if you're not familiar with it. Unlike the more brazen darkness of the Netherworld, these levels feel dark in an esoteric way that seems to escape your concepts of what reality even looks like. This map isn't a Peterson map though, it's a Tim Willits map, and he does such a great job of incorporating verticality while utilizing the water physics in a satisfying way that feels good to play in the game. It's the only Earth-based level 1 map not handled by Romero, and the only level in episode 4 not handled by Peterson. Although I have to wonder why there would be a slipgate hidden in the facility's sewage system. My only explanation for this is that the higher-ups were hiding it here because they wanted to hide access to the Elder World away even from their own people due to just how dangerous it was. This means they knew they were playing with fire here. When we finally enter the slipgate into the Elder World, we're greeted with this. I mean, just look at how cool this map is. The map is already feeling like we've entered somewhere we are really not supposed to be. This is the Tower of Despair, and it becomes very clear very quickly that things are not only going to be quite a bit harder from here on out, but also more perplexing. We can see how Quake has now fully realized its promises of dimensions beyond our comprehension, as this part of the map tries to trip you out with how its water isn't real and is simply a thin layer between you and the room below. More than that, we have to learn how to navigate these portals in a way that helps us access otherwise inaccessible parts of the map. Also, this feels like a great time to talk about an enemy we've been fighting this whole time that I haven't acknowledged yet. I would argue that the Shambler is the most iconic monster from Quake, and it's no question why. These towering monstrosities can tank swaths of your ammunition and deal out devastating blasts of pure lightning that can end you almost instantly. The name Shambler is clearly another reference to the Lovecraft mythos, as he wrote of creatures called dimensional shamblers in 2 of his stories that were described very much the same as the shamblers we see in this game. It is a topic of much debate whether or not these things have fur, with even Romero giving contradicting answers to this question. In the years since, we've received various descriptions and depictions of shamblers, and the common consensus has become that their having fur or simply muscle and flesh is contingent on the climate within which they reside. Fair enough answer in my book. What we do know for sure is that shamblers feed on rifts created in space-time by slipgates and the other monsters. Escaping the Tower of Despair, we find ourselves at the Elder God Shrine. Peterson was really flexing his insane tendency for abstract map design here too, because this map is crazy. The majority of his maps utilize most of, if not all of the available level themes. One of the most recognizable parts of this map for me was when we take an underground pool that leads out into a graveyard where a multitude of zombies are shuffling around. I love this location too. It's the only time we see such a recognizable outdoor area like this across the game that I can think of. This graveyard opens up into a long series of winding maze-like corridors that make it easy to get lost without realizing it, especially since so many of the walls open to reveal enemies or secrets. You have to pay attention to where you are here, or you'll find yourself running across a floor that retracts away from you. Once we wind up in the horrid tunnels of this desolate location, we're introduced to a new enemy we've never encountered before called the... These little things are pretty universally hated by Quake players due to how deadly and dangerous they are. They're native only to the Elderworld so far as the original game is concerned, and can jump very far, very fast. Even worse, they erupt into a massive explosion when killed, which can deal crippling damage to the player. They only show up in the game's later levels due in part to how difficult they are, but also because they were conceived fairly late in Quake's development. If you can push your way through these dark hallways and survive the explosive spawn enemies, then you will find the large gate into the next area called the Palace of Hate. And man, that's a pretty apt name given how insane this level is. The gate from the shrine takes us deeper underground into a palace-like structure, complete with massive chambers and strange layouts that seem to lead back into themselves in a confusing fashion. The game has pulled out nearly all the stops now, the maps are bigger and more imposing than ever, and the enemies are higher in number than before. It's so intense that the map offers a small pit of water called a healing pool to help the player survive this labyrinth of a level. I'm not sure what I could say to properly explain how overwhelming this map felt to me in my initial playthrough, honestly. The size and design had me questioning where I was repeatedly and looking for landmarks to try and note where I was and had been to make it easier to navigate the place. We can even find one of the game's more common small enemies that I haven't talked about yet. Seemingly modeled after a piranha, and even referred to as such in the leaked Beta 3 build of the game, the rotfish aren't actually all that dangerous given their size. They're relatively easy to kill and can only be found in the water of certain maps. Still, their addition adds a refreshing dynamic to the game's progression by making even the water itself a place of potential danger. Once we finally overcome these hostile environments within the Palace of Hate, we find the door to the next area of the Elderworld, a place called Hell's Atrium. Like I said before, pretty much all of these maps have been from Sandy Peterson so far, and I actually think that was the best decision the team could have made. While episodes 1 and 3 were a bit more of a mix of the other designers, relegating this final episode almost entirely to one designer allows the labyrinthian and abstract nature of each map to feel intentional, as though they're all within the same realm. I recognize why the Elderworld episode might not be everyone's favorite, but it most assuredly is mine. Hell's Atrium in particular manages to feel like such a gargantuan map, even though it's not any bigger than some of the others we've seen, just because its layout seems to draw you out and makes it hard to find familiar footing. This centerpiece that spans out into other parts of the map is recognizable, but despite how it may appear, this is not in the middle of the map. Although I do have to say this map doesn't feel nearly as difficult to navigate for me as the Palace of Hate was. The way all of these final levels integrate multiple different level themes makes it all feel even more disjointed in such a fun way. This is the final map of the game with 2 exits, although this map's secret exit is particularly well hidden from you if you don't know where it is. I can tell they did this on purpose with the poles, knowing players would try to bypass the level just to see if they could, and that's why this message appears warning the player to go back and find the Thunderbolt if they haven't yet. Of course, we're going to talk about the secret level of the Elderworld, accessible at the end of Hell's Atrium. Going through the secret door takes us straight to the Nameless City. It's actually a pretty ambitious level by Quake standards too, and it's the only map that actively attempts to look like a small town in any way. Of course, this is another reference to H.P. Lovecraft, specifically his short story also called The Nameless City. If you hadn't guessed it yet, a lot of Quake's Lovecraftian elements came from Sandy Petersen, although not all of them are due to him alone, as other members of the team did contribute a lot of the Lovecraftian references as well. And speaking of Petersen, this is actually one of his less overwhelming levels. It's still big, but I'd call it a medium-sized map in relation to the other maps within the game, although it definitely still has a kind of puzzle-esque nature to its layout. It's pretty unique in that it's the only area to try looking so blatantly like a small town, but I'd say that's the most interesting thing about it. I do have to wonder why these monsters are here and what happened to the population of this city. Was it once a bustling town of life before the forces of Quake overran it? Hard to say. Completing this level, we're put back on track to our goal as we enter the Pain Maze. And I'll tell you now that it's another very accurate map title. There's a lot of bizarre architecture filled with hordes of malevolent monsters all here to kill you and defend the unholy altars. Oh yeah, and speaking of, this level introduces something that would go on to become more commonplace in idSoftware games down the line, but was kind of unprecedented at the time. An objective. I'm not talking kill all the enemies or collect all the keys. This level gives us a genuine in-world concept that we must complete before we can move on to the next area. We've seen things in this vein before, but there's something about having an actual task to complete that seems to progress a narrative context that makes this level feel very special. This isn't just flipping switches. That task is to defile the unholy altars. Walls in the game made for these abominations to worship the wretched witch goddess Shub-Niggurath. Don't let my adoration of this concept mislead you into thinking this level is a fun time though, at least not in the casual fun sense. This pain maze, as it were, is in actuality a temple, and you can tell from the architecture that it has been designed with reverence to the evil Old One in mind. The stone walls and stained glass windows are kind of a dead giveaway. Although everything here wants to kill you, and they're pretty frustrated about you defiling their unholy altars like that. This level also makes it very apparent why the other developers thought the spawn enemy should be saved for the final episode, because those things are brutal to fight. Once we reach the end of this level, we enter our final map of the episode, Azure Agony. The first thing this map does is drop a shambler on top of us, by the way, in case you weren't convinced this was the end of the line. The Azure title is also very fitting since the whole building is saturated in a perpetual hint of hazy blue. It almost feels like we've wound up in the abandoned chambers of an ancient society of powerful mages or something. I'm not exactly sure what this place is supposed to be, but it's massive and filled with moving parts. It also had the largest file size of any map from the game, which is very fitting since it's the last real map here. Although I do have to say it's quite a bit less intense than the map that precedes it. I know the usual expectation of the final level would be the hardest, most enemy-dense map imaginable, but this is not that. Instead, what we get here is something more vast and empty feeling, almost like it's building anticipation. You'll spend most of your time on this map trying to solve the puzzles rather than killing monsters, which is kind of cool. It seems to inject a trepidatious atmosphere of anxiety in you since there's so few enemies comparatively to how massive and empty this building is. Of course, all of this is in pursuit of one goal, the final rune. We've collected all 3 of the other runes, and we've only got one left to go, the Rune of Elder Magic. Once we solve the puzzles of this vacant, bewildering building, access to the rune is granted, and we swipe it on our way out of the Elderworld and back to Earth. Our end episode text comes on screen to fill us in on what this all means and tells us that we now have knowledge beyond morality, and even beyond life and death. Shub-Niggurath plans to eradicate all life on Earth, and we are the last thread of hope holding together the very fabric of reality itself. If we fail, then existence as we know it will cease to exist. With the power of all 4 ancient runes, we are able to blast open the gateway to her dark dimension as we prepare for our final confrontation. The game itself tells the player that if you defeat her, you will be remembered forever as the savior of the planet. If she conquers, it will be as if you had never been born. Returning to Earth, we see that we used the reality-altering power of the runes to blast open a new pathway directly beneath the facility we've been operating out of. A winding staircase takes us down an ancient portal where text appears on screen to tell us that Shub-Niggurath awaits us. One final battle to save reality itself. Dropping instantly into a pool of bacteria-infested still water, we are immediately swarmed by rotfish that we have to kill before making our way to a portal that looks unlike any we've seen before. Whereas previous portals were a purple color, this one is orange, like the color of lava. No turning back now. We leap through the portal and find ourselves face to face with the Old One herself. Codenamed Quake, known also as the Hell Mother, All Mother, and the Witch Goddess. Also taken from Lovecraft lore, she is the only Old One we encounter in Quake, although the original plan for the game was to have our hero encounter multiple Old Ones that she had imprisoned across the game and free them to help us stop her. These plans were scrapped, however, likely to save time so the game could release sooner. Over many strange aeons, she has imprisoned a multitude of dimensions under her rule, and once humanity discovered slipgate technology, she was made aware of our existence and planned to bring us under her control as well by altering the slipgates to lead into her dimension so she could send her forces through. Her plan was to acquire the 4 runes of ancient magic and use them to wipe humanity out and take Earth as her own. But we got to them first, and now that the runes belong to us, even death may die. This level kind of makes up for the more relaxed tone of that last mission, because this one is very intense. We have to fight our way through multiple Shamblers and Vores, both of which are basically the strongest enemies in the game, all the while the Old One rests wickedly atop an island in a lake of pure lava like the inverted root of an evil tree jutting out from the ground. Although there is no direct interaction with the Old One here, as she cannot attack you directly and your weapons have no effect on her. This isn't really a boss battle, it's more of a final level loaded with a dozen of the game's most powerful enemies for you to take out in a small arena filled with deadly traps meant to kill you. There's only one way to kill this interdimensional monstrosity though, and that's with interdimensional weaponry. Yeah, we have to wait until that portal receiver goes through her organic brain and jump through this portal gate to telefrag her. Awesome. With Shub-Nigrath defeated, we receive our final congratulatory message and our first look at our protagonist from an outside perspective as he stands by the corpse of the Old One herself. And that's all 4 episodes of Quake, one of the most iconic and important video games ever released to the public market. It's not the longest game either. I think on normal difficulty you can realistically beat the whole thing in around 5 hours without even really trying, but it's still such a brilliantly fun time every time. If you're the type to be into completionism, then each level is stuffed with secrets and enemies for players who love chasing that 100% completion metric. And don't even get me started on speedrunning. Unless you're a pro's pro, then you're gonna have a hard time beating any of the already established speedrun records for this game. Although I do love watching Quake speedrunners. It's a game almost built for speedrunning, and a lot of fun to watch pros take runs at it. Quake is a total powerhouse title, and on top of the enormous impact it had on gaming, it also marked the end of the original idSoftware team as many core members departed soon after Quake released. Apparently, the development cycle was extremely intense, and various members have since stated that there were a lot of internal conflicts and a lack of clear leadership. It's kind of a wonder how the game ended up so good in light of how much turmoil it went through to get made. It's also a little bit sad too, because although I love the game we got, I think most of the team members felt it to be kind of a shadow of their intended product, but in different ways. The Quake John Romero had imagined and actually wanted to make did not look like this at all. He even stated in an interview later that despite his game Daikatana not being a success, that it was closer to the game he had wanted Quake to be, and that he had a lot more fun working on that one than he did on Quake. And of course, the series would shift direction so radically after so much of the original team departed that this game would become a one-off oddity in a way, but somehow, I still feel like the game we got here was everything that it needed to be. Now obviously I do love Quake, and I've had such a blast playing through it and researching it for this video, but I felt like I could use the input of another creator on this one, so I reached out to GmanLives and asked him to lend me his FPS expertise for this one to tell us a little bit about what makes Quake so special.
Quake for me is really one of those rare games where I can distinctly remember where and when I was when I first discovered it. It was at the local shopping mall that we used to go to when I was a kid, and they had this gaming store right up the front there that had a CRT monitor in the front window that was always showing off footage of some kind of random PC game. One of those days, it happened to be Quake, showing off that early demo where you get the grenade launcher and then jib that little group of zombies. And that there is how I first saw Quake in action, and actually too how I even learned it existed. Not even really kind of knowing at that point either that it was made by the same people who'd made Doom. I remember too that, a lot like Doom before it, shareware copies of this thing were everywhere, and I ended up becoming good mates with a kid at school who was also playing it at the same time. And much like Doom, it really just was one of those watershed moments for the industry, where people who weren't really into gaming or didn't even know what the whole thing was about could look at something like Quake and be genuinely impressed and interested. And alongside other games that year like Resident Evil, Duke Nukem 3D and Diablo, it was really kind of showing the leaps and strides that this medium was making. My fondest memory is always going to be playing it alongside my dad, with it always starting off with the two of us taking turns at each level, before he'd eventually go off to do dad stuff I guess, leaving me to play by myself for hours on end. And even nowadays, when I go back to replay through this thing, especially that first episode, really feels like I'm putting on an old comfy pair of jeans or an old pair of sneakers. The fact we're still getting shooters today that are heavily influenced by it, I mean, it's just a bit of a testament to how good of a game this thing was, and why it's definitely earned its place amongst those ranks of the best of the best.
Shout out to GmanLives for dropping in on this one. I've been a huge fan of his content for a while now and was hyped at the prospect of working with him on this. Thanks, man. Always a pleasure. Now, there's a few things I wanted to talk about before we wrap up here, and one of those things I actually mentioned a few times already while we went through the levels. The level theming. Each of the levels in Quake is made up of textures and assets from one of Quake's various pre-made level themes. These themes are as follows. idBase, the grungy sci-fi look we see in the earlier levels of each episode. Wizard, the more fantasy-inspired environments like castles and ancient ruins. Runic, the darker dungeon-like textures made up of old stone and metal surfaces. Terracotta, the more clay-based environments such as bricks and also including spikes and some crates. And Elderworld, which has a lot of the decaying wood and brown monolithic ruins we see throughout the game. There was an ancient Aztec-inspired level theme that I touched on earlier called Maya, but like I said before, it was not utilized in the main game due to a conflict of vision. Although some levels restrict themselves to using only one of these themes, a lot of them combine the level themes to make certain levels feel grander and more varied throughout. It's just such an interesting way to go about designing the look of your levels that I had to bring it up here. Something else I wanted to talk about here is Quake's dabbling in religious themes and iconography in some of its levels. I'm a bit of a nerd about this stuff, so if you don't really care about it, feel free to skip it in the timestamps. Playing as someone who loves to get invested into new worlds and learn how the lore and universe works within the confines of the author's intent, Quake can be a little bit difficult to come to grips with because of its disjointed nature. It's very clearly a deeply Lovecraftian-inspired world with creatures, concepts, and even its main villain ripped straight from the pages of Lovecraft's own works. However, there are also references to things from the Abrahamic religions, predominantly Christianity. We see a single depiction of the crucifixion of Christ in one level, and more than a few levels with cross imagery adorning the walls. This is all mainly in the Netherworld, which I think is being implied to be Hell itself, given that it's where we find the rune of Hell magic. This would not be all that surprising given that the entire premise of Quake's own predecessor in Doom is about going to Hell. Even Hell itself is a concept from the Abrahamic text, again in this instance clearly the Christian Old Testament interpretation. Now, if you're thinking to yourself that the answer to this is that John Romero and American McGee just liked the edge factor of including those things in the Hell-based episode's levels because it was super edgy by 90s standards, then, well, I'm sure you're actually right about that. It's no secret that some of the team members, Romero in particular, were not overly fond of Christianity and conceptualized the nail gun to jokingly shoot the mural depicting Christ in-game. Although Romero has since stated that it was never his intention to offend anyone with the games he worked on, which is why I say they were just being edgy at the time. It really is probably not that deep from a lore perspective, and Quake's own concept was having massive world-altering changes made to its lore design even right up to its own release due to development conflicts within the team. However, I don't think this intention was all that malicious beyond simple edgelord content, since, as I mentioned before, Sandy Peterson was one of the developers on the game and he himself is a Mormon. In a video on his YouTube channel, Peterson even claims that when he voiced his concern about one level featuring the player stepping on a depiction of Christ in the base game to Romero, that Romero was happy to remove it, and it almost seemed like it hadn't occurred to him that he was crossing a line. Now, as a Christian myself, do I think that Quake is offensive? No, actually I don't. I can see how some may feel uneasy about it, but personally, I've voiced my discontent with the puritanical nature of some Christians before, and I honestly think most of them need to be shaken out of their comfort, so not only am I fine with Quake, I think more people should probably be exposed to it. Also, I think Peterson put it perfectly when Romero asked him if he'd be comfortable working on Doom, and Peterson replied saying, quote, "I have no problems with the demons in the game, they're just cartoons, and anyway, they're the bad guys," end quote. The main problem I have with this is that it makes it difficult to figure out why another dimension called the Netherworld is filled with Christian imagery. This is a strange thing to reckon with lore-wise because it means that these buildings were either built within the last 2,000 years or that they were more ancient but knew of the coming of Christ during their construction. Here's my theory. Those of you relatively familiar with Christian theology may have heard of the harrowing of hell. This is the period directly after the scripture tells us that Christ yielded up the ghost. And the harrowing of hell, Christ descends into hell to bring salvation to the souls there since the beginning of the world, and establishes himself as the king of all things. So with that in mind, even hell itself must pay reverence to the ruler of all existence. I am happy to acknowledge that as a stretch, by the way, and also I'm not a theologian. I'm just a YouTuber who plays a lot of video games, so I'm doing my best to make sense of this lore-wise because lore is kind of what I do, and I love lore, and this is fun for me. Again, obviously the devs were just being edgy, and it's not that deep, but if I had to make sense of it in a lore capacity, that would be my headcanon. Anyway, let's talk about guns. Quake has 8 weapons for the player to use across their journey, and most of them have their own unique uses. The axe is the first of the available weapons and a throwback to when Quake was being planned as a melee-focused video game. Ironically, not only is it the only melee weapon in the game, but you'll use it so infrequently that you'll spend most of your playtime forgetting that you have it. It's actually so hard to rely on that being killed by another player with it in deathmatch is considered a humiliation. The second weapon is the shotgun, old, reliable, and a constant in any Quake playthrough. This firearm is actually the player's starting weapon in Quake, which was an intentional statement from idSoft that Quake is so hardcore it outright skips the starter weapons by giving you the shotgun from moment 1. Despite being a shotgun, I tended to use it mostly as a ranged weapon to pick off enemies from a distance without blowing through my ammo since it's also a hit scan weapon. If you're needing some heavier firepower, then that's where the super shotgun comes in. 2 barrels means twice the gun with twice the fun. It also means burning through your shotgun ammo twice as fast, so while it's useful for killing things quickly, just be sure you're using it where it counts. Quake doesn't have any standard issue machine guns or fully automatic rifles of any kind, but it does have a nail gun, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. A full auto gas-powered terror machine that fires massive nails into your foes. Too bad this weapon becomes entirely obsolete by the super nail gun, which you acquire shortly after this one. No, seriously, the uselessness of this weapon within the gameplay loop became so obvious that John Romero later expressed his regret for how it was handled. Speaking of the super nail gun, it's basically the same thing but fires 2 nails per shot instead of 1 and can burn through 200 nails in 10 seconds. The thing is an absolute beast and will become a mainstay in your relied upon weapons in the game. Of course, most of the more hard-boiled enemies in the game will require a more explosive solution, and that's where the grenade launcher will come into play. Although there's a bit of a learning curve to using it due to splash damage and the fact that unless it hits an enemy directly, it will bounce around for a few seconds before exploding. This bouncy element makes it one of the most useful weapons in the game to have though, especially if you're running backwards from an enemy and want to bounce the grenade off a wall and around a corner. Most of this stops mattering when you get the rocket launcher though. I don't want to call it the end-all firearm of Quake or anything, but if we're being honest, this is going to be your primary weapon, especially on harder difficulties and in later episodes. Then we have the game's answer to Doom's BFG called the Thunderbolt, also known as the Lightning Gun. It's easily the most powerful weapon in the game, and it's a hit scan weapon capable of doing tremendous amounts of damage at once. Just don't fire it underwater unless you've either got a protection power-up or a death wish. It's thought that this weapon is an attempt to execute on idSoft's original idea of the player character in Quake having a hammer of thunderbolts. It's an awesome weapon idea, although ammo for it is pretty rare, so I didn't get to use it as much as I'd have liked to. All of these aforementioned qualities came together within the walls of idSoftware's office back in the mid-90s to create what would become one of the most important video games of all time. Although not as well known as its predecessor Doom, I think it would still be fair to call Quake an industry-shifting title. One that laid the foundation for even more revolutionary titles to come, like Half-Life, Hexen, and even Call of Duty. Something else I haven't mentioned yet, but you know I have to talk about here is Quake's original soundtrack. Whereas the Doom games were known at the time for their upbeat and aggressive MIDI music, idSoftware envisioned Quake as having a significantly more sinister and grounded OST to score its levels. The team managed to strike a deal with Nine Inch Nails frontman and lead composer Trent Reznor to compose an entire soundtrack for their game, and the result is the ambient industrial masterpiece we now associate with the game's different levels. Although the main theme is a classic banger, it's also one of the only tracks in the game that features such a traditional song structure, as nearly every other track in the game could be be more appropriately referred to as an ambient soundscape than as an actual song. Of course, since the team were already fans of his work, the ammunition for the nail gun was embellished with the Nine Inch Nails logo on the boxes as a reference to the band since they were working together on this. The intention was to have songs that added to the atmospheric tension of each level without distracting the player from the fact that they were fighting their way through a nightmarish other world filled with chaos and anguish. Not to mention they wanted the tracks to be easily loopable since they didn't know how long players might spend in each level. Although due to a deal with Interscope Records at the time, the music had to be burned onto the CD and the disc would have to be inserted into the PC for the game to feature the music. This meant that for over 2 decades, downloadable versions of the game didn't feature any music. That included the Steam version. I actually remember very vividly going through an arduous process a few years ago to make my Steam version of Quake play the OST without needing the disc to be inserted. It was doable, but it was annoying and a little bit time-consuming just to play the game as it was intended. Eventually, in 2019, Reznor contacted idSoft about wanting to do a vinyl release of the Quake soundtrack, and a deal was made that benefited not only both parties, but also the players, since I'm pretty sure that deal is the reason why the Night Dive remaster features the original soundtrack restored to the game and all of its downloadable, no-disc required glory. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to use the actual soundtrack in this video though, since I'm pretty sure it's copyright registered, but I am a fan of the OST and think Reznor did a great job of nailing the atmospheric sound of Quake. Pun intended. The technology idSoftware pioneered with Quake was something the rest of the industry hadn't even seen before, and long after its release, people are still using terms that were born from the Quake community, like the phrase rocket jumping. Yeah, that came from Quake because of how the physics engine worked, not to mention how this same engine would be modified by developers into other engines as time went on. Ever heard of the Source engine? Yeah, well, Half-Life started out on a modified Quake engine first. Ultimately though, I think one of the single most impressive things that Quake did was expose a market of normies to such extreme edgelord content. Don't get me wrong, I adore this kind of stuff. It's totally on brand for my personal taste, but even in the late 90s and early 2000s when pop culture was at an all-time edginess high, this was still a bit extreme, even by the standards of how niche video games were as a hobby. Concepts like parallel dimensions wouldn't break into the mainstream consciousness for over 2 more decades, and H.P. Lovecraft's mythos, although beloved by millions now, was not very well known at that time by any metric. Back then, your average person would have no notion of the word Cthulhu, and even by today's standards, Lovecraft's mythos seems to be at its most profitable when cut with a cutesy look and drained of any actual bite. On top of that, I'm not sure this level of grungy, abstract, horror-like aesthetic has ever really been very widely accepted, back then or today. Quake was so ahead of its time in so many ways that I'm not sure the developers have even recognized it yet. We see ideas like the multiverse all the time now, and Cthulhu is 1 or 2 steps away from being a household name at this point, but in 1996, the average person would have no idea what the hell you were talking about if you brought any of that up. Moreover, even throughout its development, the team's own ideas of what they wanted Quake to be went through so many changes that what we actually got seems to be a combination of compromises that just so happened to meld themselves into a perfect storm of everything Quake needed to be for it to work. Despite seeing multiple sequels in the Quake franchise line, Quake has still not seen a real sequel. Mechanically, arguably, yes, but conceptually and narratively, this game stands alone. Quake is one of a kind. There is no other game like Quake. There are a strong handful of games, both commercial and indie, that are great in their own right and manage to resemble the shadow of some facets Quake expressed, be that narratively or mechanically, but no one game has ever managed to truly match Quake in the eccentric and quite frankly esoteric offerings that it has as a video game. To me, it stands as a total turning point in the medium of video games. Everything before and after Quake feels like 2 different eras of the industry, and I think that's for good reason. And that's why I'm convinced that Quake really did change everything in the industry the day that it hit the market. A gothic, Lovecraftian, horror-themed action shooter brimming with violence, explosions, and other dimensions all rests just on the other side of a single slipgate. Thanks for sticking through this video with me. This is one I've been wanting to make for over 2 years now, and after finally diving into it and talking about it, I think it's one of my best ones yet. Now, if you couldn't tell, I left a lot of stuff out of this video. That's because this is technically part 1 of 2 regarding my coverage of Quake. I wanted to focus this one on the core game, just the original 4 idSoftware developed episodes. Part 2 is currently slotted to be included in the complete series retrospective compilation video I'm planning for later this year. Multiple Quake games that I won't be giving their own video will be included in the long compilation, so keep an eye out for that. Some of the things I'll be talking about in part 2 of my Quake 1 coverage are the first and second mission packs, Scourge of Armagon and Dissolution of Eternity, the 2 later add-ons, Dimension of the Past and Dimension of the Machine, the Deathmatch multiplayer mode, and then some additional insight into cut content, the modding community, and some coverage of the Nintendo 64 port of the game. Until then, make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it and leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe if you haven't already, because up next I'll be tackling the controversial follow-up that changed the direction of the series forever, Quake 2. Members of the channel get access to most of my content early, and a few additional member-only goodies like exclusive reviews and live stream replays. Thanks again so much to everyone for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video, but until then, that's all I've got for you. Quake.